you can open to John 1. We're gonna open it up here for some Q&A, and again, I'm gonna say some things, and Don can chime in too. But I want to just get your gears going a little bit. I know this helps sometimes. So, John 1, written by the Apostle John, and when we started the Real Life Grace series, we looked at 1 John, and when I think of the Apostle John, I think of a guy who really appreciated the fact that Jesus came into this world, that Jesus came into the world of messed up, broken people and provided salvation. And so we looked at 1 John way back then, where he talks about the importance of understanding that Jesus was a flesh and blood person who lived here in an actual body and died in an actual body and was raised, and how that gives us hope. And in John, the Gospel of John, which he also wrote, he talks about the same idea and talks about it in a little different way that's, I think, extremely encouraging. So I'm just going to briefly walk through this. Again, get your gears going on the topic of real life grace, Jesus in the real world with you and your real messes. So let me just say a couple things about this. Start in verse 1 of John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Notice, first of all, that the title ascribed to Jesus there is the Word. And it's saying the Word was God in terms of the nature of the Word is God, very God, but also the Word was with God. So God was there with God, is what it's saying. God, the Word, was there with God, the Father, and was in a relationship. And some even would say, some of the linguists would say, hey, this even has to do with a face-to-face relationship. When it says with God, that word is actually toward God. So they're there face-to-face throughout all eternity. There's this relationship in heaven. Verse 3, all things came into being through him, through the Word. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Now he shifts from the Word. He's saying Jesus is the Word, which has to do with the idea of communication. The Word which brings something from the heart and mind of one person to the heart and mind of another person, from God to us. He's the Word in that sense, and he's the light, which shines in the darkness. And it says the darkness did not comprehend it. And depending on what translation you have, it might say the darkness did not overpower it. So we've looked at all sorts of topics in this Real Life Grace series. Addiction, anxiety, anger, depression, unforgiveness, conflict. I mean, all sorts of topics that are not easy concepts, not fun ideas. You know, who wants to think about addiction, anxiety? I mean, there's all words that have negative connotations, right? And when I meet with people, and when you talk with people and you hear about their deepest struggles, you are, in those moments, encountering darkness. When you are struggling with your own addictions and anxieties and anger and frustration and greed, you are experiencing darkness. Well, right up front, John says, here's what's amazing. The everlasting God, the creator of all things, comes into his creation. He comes as light, and he comes into the darkness, and he's not overcome by the darkness. Instead, he overcomes it. He conquers it. Jump ahead to verse 9. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own. Those who were his own did not receive him, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So developing that idea of the light, he's saying he comes and he enlightens every man. He's the only one who really understands. So this is what's fascinating. The term translated word in the beginning of the chapter, some of you may know this, some of you Bible students in here, it's the Greek word logos, and you may have heard of that word in other contexts. Logos, that word is kind of a weighty, powerful word. It has a lot of depth to it. In the first century when John wrote this, the Greek philosophers would talk about the logos, and to them it was like an impersonal, rational force in the universe that kind of was responsible for everything. In some ways, they would attribute creation to the Logos. The Logos kind of is responsible for everything being made, but it was not a personal being. It was just a rational, ethereal, impersonal power force, or almost mind of some kind, almost like this mind that ruled the universe. It was known as the Logos, and philosophers would discuss and debate how all that happened. And some would say, there was a philosopher who was Jewish named Philo, and he would say the Logos represented the ideal man. So in everything we're experiencing down here, we all, to some degree, contemplate humanity and who we are as human beings and what we're like, and we give some thought to that, at least most of us do. And Philo would say the Logos was the concept of the ideal man, the ideal person. Why am I telling you all that? Because Jesus is the embodiment of the Logos. He's the creator of the universe. He is personal. He is relational. And he is the ideal man, isn't he? He's the man all men ought to be but are not. He's the ideal man. He's the true man. We were saying earlier that in the context of relationships with people who are skeptics, who would say, you can't prove it, and it's all just myths and fairy tales, and it's all moralistic and hypocritical. And I have so many friends and family members in that category, and as I talk to them, I'll tell you what I hear. Even though they're skeptical about things of faith and the Bible, well, here's what I hear all the time. Why are people so screwed up? And sometimes, in honest moments, why am I so screwed up? And why is everybody else so screwed up? Implicitly, you know what that cries out for? The ideal man. Where's the ideal man? I have a concept of an ideal man, but I don't see him anywhere. And obviously included with that would be the ideal woman too. Where is he? So it's interesting. John, in his day, that same discussion was going on, sort of. And he says, look, here's who the Son of God is. He is the ideal man. He is the Logos. He is the Word. He is that rational mind that designed and created everything and that governs everything. He is all of that. And he's the light, without which you can only have darkness. Just a little more here. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. Real life grace is the name of our series. Well, Jesus embodies grace. Verse 17, for the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth were realized or came into being through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. When we think about these topics of addiction and anger and anxiety and unforgiveness and conflict, and we've talked about hero worship, and last week we talked about defensiveness, and all these topics about the dark parts of humanity. The greatest hope is that God came into this world, that the Word became flesh, that the light came into the darkness, that life came into death. That is our hope. And so every one of those topics, I hope it's clear that I'm not intending to communicate, hey, if you're an addict, here's how you go fix that. If you're anxious, here's how you fix that. It's not about you fixing that. He says here, the law was given through Moses. God gave law to people. Here are the standards that correlate with my character, is what God says. Hey, I've given you those standards. You received the law, but here's the problem. There's nothing we can do with that, because in and of ourselves, we're dead. We don't have life. We don't have light. We're not God, we're human, and we're rebellious humans. And so everything John is saying here, and everything I've been trying to convey is, your hope is that God comes to you. That he comes into your life. That he rescues you. The law was given through Moses. People in our day have their own law of how, 10 steps to becoming a better version of yourself in this way or that way, 10 steps to taking taking control of your life. Here's how you get a handle on your finances or your weight problem or this or that and the other thing. And those are all functional and have their benefits down here, but they all presuppose that you have to do something to get to this end. Here's what's different. Here's what's otherworldly about the gospel and spiritual life is that it's all a gift. It's not a transaction. And all these topics we've talked about, from addiction to anxiety to unforgiveness, are all related to the spiritual realm. They're all part of your spiritual being. They have everything to do with how you view God and relate to him and how you view and relate to other people. And the hope held out for us is the person, grace and truth being realized, coming in, literally that word means coming into being in this world. And Jesus, thousands of years ago, left. So now what? Well, he gave us his Spirit as the down payment, as the pledge of our inheritance, and who's with us and who unites us to the person of Christ and the life of God. And that is our hope. And it has a lot to do with how we understand these ups and downs of our practical Christian lives. So I want to be clear about that. And then share this quote with you. And then interact with you a little bit. Jackie Hill Perry. Damon, do you know that name? I think she's one of the spoken word people. Is that right? Yeah. So I just saw a quote from her. She's a Christian poet. And she said this: if your love for theology doesn't work itself out in love for people, then you may be in love with the words themselves and not the God who wrote them. The whole point of the written words of the Bible is the living word of Jesus, the conveyance of God's life from him to us. The whole point of what we say is to convey Christ with the hope that, one, we'll see him, we'll be amazed by him, we'll be freed little by little from all the other things that we treasure down here, and we'll see how great he is and his love for us. And two, that the spillover of that might actually be love for our fellow man, for another person, concern for another person. So those are some things I was thinking about as I was looking at John 1 this week, and again, thought maybe that would get your gears going a little bit. So with that in mind, and with everything else we've talked about for months in mind, for those of you who have been here, any questions? It's a good question. Did you guys hear that? I mean, you're plagued by anger, unforgiveness, defensiveness. You're blind in those moments to who God is. You're not believing him at all. And you are enslaved and engaged in some kind of destruction. So we've been looking at David in Sunday school, and some of you have been in there for that. And the last, well, especially today, we looked at just some of the things that went on in David's life and a lot of the ugly, evil things David was guilty of. So we've looked at a lot of that. And one of the things we've been trying to point out is what's amazing is that God doesn't abandon what's going on there. I mean, David was guilty of adultery and having people murdered and numbering the people. There's all sorts of things. You look at King David's life, I mean, he was guilty in a lot of areas. He was a horrible human being, we could really say, if you look at his life honestly. So what's amazing, though, is, and we point out this morning, so when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, the first child, do you remember what happened to that first child as a consequence? What happened? Child died. God said the child's going to die, and in fact, the child died. Do you know who the next child was conceived by David and Bathsheba? Solomon. Can you think of any king out there in the future who comes through that line? Jesus comes from that line. In a million different ways, the Bible is showing us and human history is showing us that God takes the messes we make and redeems them. And I think that overarching context makes sense of my bout with impatience on the road or frustration with my kids. And I'm blind to God in the moment and I'm not seeing what he's up to, but does that mean he's not up to something? If he is who the Bible declares him to be and he's consistent and he never changes, which the Bible says he never changes, then he's still working. And at some point, in some way, he is going to insert himself and redeem the situation. And that doesn't mean he's going to prevent bad things from happening necessarily. Oftentimes he lets those bad things happen, but how will he come alongside to show that he is life, that he's the true liberator, that love and joy and peace are good things and they only come from him? And I know you and I have talked enough, David, to know that in our ups and downs, you and I have both experienced that. We have dark days where we're not really seeing things clearly and we're frustrated and we feel empty. And then there's other days where God just turns the lights on and we say, wow, God showed up in one way or another through a person and what they said to me, through a song I heard, through just some other aspect of common grace where like God just shows himself over and over. And sometimes I think, well, God, why have you not given up on me? I mean, I've given up on me. Why have you not given up on me? And he just doesn't. That's my take. What do you want to add?
Probably shouldn't give this example, but I'm in the middle of dad hell. And it's kind of related to what we were talking about in Sunday school, Jack, when I gave the example of marriage. So when I say I'm in the middle of dad hell, I am in the bigger part of many days overcome with my anger and frustration and impatience because I want a certain attitude to come from my kids. I want a certain level of obedience to come from my kids. And when I say attitude, I want them to be happy. I want them to be satisfied. I want a lot of good things for that are good for my kids that I believe should be. And when that doesn't happen, it's not fun for anybody in my family. And it's not fun for me. So in one sense, I could sit here and paint a picture of what I should be as a dad. And of course, I'm experiencing a lot of things too. I feel like I'm failing in certain aspects. And in one sense, I could say, well, let's talk about how things should be. Whether that's how I should be as a dad or how kids should. And if we could just work that out and follow that formula, then life would be peaceful, right? Well, what I'm finding out, especially with what Jeff just talked about or read out of John 1, is this concept of the Word becoming flesh. He's the light in the midst of darkness. He has come as to exemplify grace and truth, not law, he's the ultimate, ruler. He's the ultimate ruler in that he's the only one that gives, like we've been talking about in Sunday school. He's the only master that gives. He's the only king that is in it for his creation. And so the more, and I'm not saying that we do this purposefully in the sense of, okay, now I'm going to try to be a dad that's angry all the time so that I can see the contrast between God and myself. But for me and my flavor, as he's exposing my heart for what it is, in that, I'm turning my kids from attitude to obedience to wanting a certain level of peace in my household. I'm turning that into my master. And it's ruling me. And it's resulting in frustration and anger because I can't control it. And the more that I see that, and that is becoming vivid in my own heart and my own life, the more I'm seeing Christ for the true liberator that he really is. Because now I can see Christ and go, he is offering me freedom. I I'm still trying to extract that freedom for myself, but I'm at least able to look at Christ and go, yeah, he's the real king that is offering freedom. And it's a freedom that only he can give me. I can't attain it for myself. I think that contrast in real life has to happen, and in a very real sense continues to happen throughout the remainder of our life. Not that we don't experience the freedom that Christ is offering, but that condition is so ingrained in us that it really does take this lifetime for him to bring us through that, so that we really do see him for the good God that he really is. I mean, I think I'll preach on Psalm 107 next week, because it really lays that out in a perfect way. I don't know if that helps.
And you guys, so the picture of that Psalm 107 is the Israelites enslaved, and they found themselves enslaved over and over and over again, from one people group to another, right? Just over and over. And it's that picture of them being overpowered by something stronger than them. Your anger issues, my anger issues, anxiety issues, unforgiveness issues, those are forces that are stronger than us in our flesh that would just dominate us into oblivion. And here's a God who just pursues and rescues and communicates with us, even sometimes in those moments of anger, like the still small voice of, hey, is that how I treat you as your dad, as your heavenly Father? Is that how I treat you? I know those are some things that go through my mind. And then in that moment too, part of the release valve of to take the pressure off is when I hear this, I don't condemn you. Jeff, I see you in your rage and I forgive you. I've already cleansed you. That's something, you're not going to get that from this world. You're probably not going to get that from your kids even. They probably don't forgive you. Not to the degree God does. They're just as ticked at you as you are at them. It's just amazing. But that's the reality of God meets us in those places. So, yeah. The costly pearl and the hidden treasure are two that are side by side in Scripture in Matthew, and I believe depict the believer who sees, if you remember the story, the hidden treasure man buys a field. Is that right? And I might have to look at it, but he buys a field, and he knows there's this treasure in the field, and so he buys that field because he knows in that field is this hidden treasure. And because of the value of that, he sells everything and he buys it. And so it has to do with Jesus saying, look, unless you give up your life, unless you let go of everything else, you don't belong to me. And so it's underlying it is that issue of value. So the same thing with the pearl, right? The pearl of great price. Some people might say, well, that's Jesus valuing the church, valuing his people. And so he lays everything down and purchases that. And that could be too. But I guess, what's your question, Donald, specifically? How does that idea of seeing Christ's value relate to these topics? Is that what you're asking?
I was just going to say, Donald, I think talking about the treasure, the great pearl of great price, it's in the context of the Gospels where he's coming as a friend to sinners. He's coming as a redeemer to those who need to be redeemed. He's coming as a physician to those who are sick. And so I think also that, in contrast to what I believed in my former life, that the treasure was this idea of sacrifice and a certain life that is to be emulated. Instead, it's this idea of it's the ultimate treasure that I'm being offered freedom from my kingship and my authority. And to me, that's where this idea of liberation finally makes sense. Just looking again at Romans chapter 1, and you guys know this, he says, Paul says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of God the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals. And then I think it's 3 times he says, and God gave them up. We talk about this idea of this deceived idea of personal freedom. We talked about it regarding Adam and Eve 2 weeks ago, to where they had that idea of all of our infants, by myself. And that's inherent. You didn't teach your kid that. I didn't teach my kid that. I tried to do things to extract it from them. But it's by myself. They wanted the choice. And they thought it was unfair that God or somebody else was choosing it for them. Again, the craziness is they submitted themselves to even the serpent and what the serpent was saying. So they didn't want to submit themselves to the Almighty God, but they submitted themselves to somebody else with this hope that they could be like God. So God gave them up. That's not talking about a whole bunch of people who set up an altar and bowed down to some false god. We don't even understand that concept now. But I can understand this concept of God gave me up, and he's saying, you know what, Don Brewer, you want to rule yourself? You know what? That's a prison for you, and I'm telling you, it's going to enslave you beyond belief. But I'm going to let you experience that because that's what you want. And as he miraculously lets me see that and experience the weight of that, then finally I can see him as the ultimate treasure because I'm sick of ruling myself and trying to rule everybody around me. I am tired of trying to make sure that the people around me have the attitudes that I want them to have. Remember that I'm in daddy hell? That was my
one
daughter.
of your kids. Yeah, one of your kids.
I want them to be a certain way. I can't make them be a certain way. They're their own king and queen. And the weight of that lifestyle is a weight that I can't even begin to even pull. And so now this idea of a treasure, I'm finally understanding what that means. I'm finally understanding what true liberation and freedom means. And that was the context of the whole of the Gospels. And I can't get that myself. I can only do that when I say, I give up. And like Psalm 107 says, I give up and I cry out for help in my distress. Guess where the distress came from? My own working, my own authority, my own kingship. It's a direct consequence of what I thought I was doing, and even when I thought I was doing it right. And I cry out in my distress and my pain and say, hey, God, I give up and I'm sorry. And you are the great treasure. I can't do it for myself. So that whole concept, I never really understood that before. And more every day, even though I'm not being cured of my stuff, I'm still seeing Christ more and more as the ultimate treasure of supreme value.
I just want to reiterate with that because I think it's really important. And some people might say, hey, wait a minute, that passage literally says he sold everything he had and he bought that field. And so there's sacrifice in selling what you have. Absolutely. We're talking about sacrifice on a deeper level than just, now I don't use my Sundays watching football anymore. Now I use my Sundays, I'm at church all day and I'm sacrificing that time for what. Because again, you can do that and still be doing that for self-justifying and self-satisfying reasons. We're talking about far deeper than that, the issue of, are you truly seeing the idea of a king with a capital K and a savior and a rescuer who says, I have now come to save you from you. If that's not valuable to you, then Jesus says, hey, go on your way. You know what I mean? The rich young ruler. Well, go ahead. Keep at it. So that's what he's describing. Do you feel like that was a clear answer? We can maybe come back around to it. And I would say with any of these, we're just scraping the surface with all these topics. Even in this series, 30 minutes, 35 minutes per topic. We could talk for weeks, months on one of these topics. So we always welcome interaction in any context, one-on-one, one-on-many, whatever. But hopefully that helps start to scratch the itch of that one. Yeah. And the hope and the trust is that with that foundation of God's activity and God's commitment to us and our hope being in his work in our lives, not our work for him, but his work for us and his work in us and his work through us and his work for us, and pick your preposition, in all that, the hope and the belief is not that somehow that becomes now a license to then, just like Don said, to just, okay, so I'm going to be as angry as I want to be with my kids and go for the gusto with that because God's just going to be glorified and he's going to do his thing anyway. First of all, how do you experience that? I mean, Don said, and you know it, it's misery when you're experiencing it. Secondly, does the idea of a loving God who's done that much for you really encourage you in that direction? I don't think so. And Paul says in Galatians, you have this freedom now. And the freedom he's describing is that very foundation, a God who is for you no matter what and has covered you in every way. And he says, now don't use that freedom as an occasion for the flesh, which is just destruction, but instead, through love, serve one another. Real simple. Serve one another. Bear burdens. Relieve suffering. Help each other out. You see somebody carrying something, help them pick it up. And that's, I think, the simplicity of the outworking when Jesus says, hey, this is the new, you want the commandment? You want your law? Here's your law. Love other people as I've loved you. Let that just be with you, echoing throughout your mind. How I've treated you. Look what I've done for you. Look how I'm active in your life. And live that out, which is so different from the constraints and weights and burdens of the message you hear, which is, well, if you're not doing enough, then you may not belong to God and you may not belong to this church either. We don't like you anymore, or whatever, it's implied.